Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. I'm Jonathan Scott and tonight we're live from Broadcasting House and we'll be speaking to the Chief Minister, Fabian Picardo. Good evening, Mr. Picardo.
Good evening, Jonathan.
We invited you onto the programme, of course, to discuss your recent speech to the United Nations, but before we look at the substance of that speech, could you tell us how important going to the United Nations and addressing them is for your government?
Well, anybody who knows the policy of the GSLP Liberals will know that we have firmly taken the view that it's essential to be at any forum that is considering the issue of Gibraltar, its self-determination, the rights of its people, etc. Whether that is the Committee of 24 in June, and the big political divide has been between the political parties whether to attend that session or not, or the fourth committee of the General Assembly in October, or indeed the regional seminar that's organised in May every year, which usually takes place either in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. Our view is the Gibraltarians need to be represented at any of those discussions, because we know that the Spanish delegation is going to ensure it is there putting its view, the Argentine delegation is going to be there putting its view about the Falklands, and sometimes those two dovetail with each other to try and even create new doctrines which might seek to deny the people of the Falklands and Gibraltar our certain right of self-determination.
Okay, well, we'll return to the substance of the matter very shortly. First, a reminder that Viewpoint is live tonight, so you can have your say by emailing viewpoint@gbc.gi or calling 200 79810. You can also use the hashtag GBC Viewpoint if you like. So, Mr. Picardo, you travelled to the United Nations in New York last week. Our news editor, Stephen Nish, also travelled to New York.
The Chief Minister told the Fourth Committee that his intention was to update them on the events affecting Gibraltar of the past year.
In the past 2 months alone, there have been 245 illegal incursions by Spanish state vessels into BGTW. All of these incursions are challenged at sea and or by the filing of diplomatic notes verbal. You see, this year, in the Spanish External Action Strategy on Foreign Policy, the Spanish government devotes 2 pages to the objective of the recovery of the sovereignty of Gibraltar. So let us be clear, what we are seeing in the creation of disproportionate queues, in the constant incursions into our waters, in the airspace around Gibraltar, and in the repeated defamation of Gibraltar, both here today and in the international media, is a strategy of the present Spanish government to achieve its prime foreign policy objective, the recovery of the sovereignty of our Rock of Gibraltar. Well, they can designate as much of their annual budget as they wish to that objective, but they will never achieve their aim. The whole area of the Bay of Gibraltar can be transformed into a mutually beneficial arc of prosperity that would extinguish current punishing rates of unemployment which presently afflict the Spanish side. Working on non-sovereignty issues through the established Trilateral Forum for Dialogue, which the previous Spanish government bravely pursued and this committee warmly welcomed, we can build together new relationships of trust and confidence that will yield real human and economic value in the short, medium and long term for the people of the whole of the Bay Area.
Gibraltar and the UK, Mr. Picardo concluded, stand ready to take part in tripartite talks with the Spanish government and as a prelude to that, to also take part in ad hoc talks. But what must remain clear is that Gibraltar is and will remain British.
Incursions by Spain, problems at the frontier with Spain, and elusive talks with Spain. Your speech to the United Nations was dominated by Gibraltar's relationship with her neighbour.
Well, indeed, because in the fourth committee, we're talking about the wider issue of sovereignty. Spain is making an assertion as a member of the fourth committee. This is quite different to her role in the Committee of 24. In the Committee of 24, she seeks a voice to intervene and is given permission to do so by those who are members. But in the fourth committee, as a member, she is entitled to participate in the debate. And the issue that she raises there is the straight issue of the recovery of the sovereignty of Gibraltar. So it's a little bit different when we go there. We don't just talk about delisting We also report to the Fourth Committee what's been happening during the course of the year in relation to the sovereignty claim being brought by Spain. Whilst in the Committee of 24 we tend to concentrate more on what's happened in the context of the delisting obligations and the education of people in relation to self-determination. And therefore, what I wanted to tell the UN Fourth Committee was what had been happening in the past year. You might recall that last year, the Spanish ambassador was very concerned by what I'd put to the committee because I'd told the committee that we had evidence, in fact, viewers will have seen it on GBC, of a Spanish Guardia Civil vessel shooting at a Gibraltarian jet skier. They hated that. They hated the fact that I had said that in the context of my report to the UN of what had happened during the course of that year.
If you permit me, they also hated the fact that you'd compared them to North Korea.
Well, indeed, and in fact something that the Foreign Affairs Committee has now done by demonstrating that the North Korean ambassador has been called into the Foreign Office less times than the Spanish ambassador. There's been less cause to call the North Korean ambassador into the Foreign Office than there has been to call the Spanish ambassador. That's a source, I would have thought, of huge embarrassment for them. But to have said that in the context of the Fourth Committee, to have given this report, really drove them a little bit around the bend.
And you don't regret any of that language used?
Of course not. I mean, would a Gibraltarian regret going to an international forum and telling the truth about what happens? Is it that somebody is suggesting that I should have gone to the United Nations and not reported the fact that they had shot at an innocent Gibraltarian using a jet ski on a Sunday afternoon? This year, I reported what had happened during the course of the year. I didn't have to say that anybody had been shot at on a jet ski.
Thankfully.
Thankfully, indeed. I was able to report what had happened during the course of the year. And people will have detected that in the past 3 months there's been a change of attitude by Spain. There are still the incursions. The queues are not so frequent, though. We've seen an approach which is a little bit less aggressive, at least in the institutional sense. We saw King Felipe come to New York and not mention Gibraltar, almost as if in the precursor to the vote to membership of the Security Council, the temporary membership of the Security Council, Spain wanted to obviate the issue of Gibraltar a little bit. And so I was able to reflect that in the context of what I was telling the Fourth Committee. But look, it's my obligation to tell them the truth. I'm not going to go there to somehow airbrush issues and make it seem that Spain is nicer to us than she actually is. My obligation, and what people in Gibraltar pay me to do, is to turn up there and fight our corner by expressing to the international community what it is that's actually happening here.
Well, a prominent theme in your UN speech, as we've highlighted, was Spain's violations of British Gibraltar sovereignty. Today you've been able to discuss incursions with the Secretary of State, Michael Fallon, Secretary of State for Defence. I'd like to ask you what was said between you, but first let's hear, if we can, what Mr. Fallon had to say about Spain's persistent incursions into British Gibraltar territorial waters.
These incursions do not weaken sovereignty. They may violate sovereignty, but they don't weaken or undermine it. So, that is the first point. Secondly, I am satisfied that the squadron and the police here have the resources that they need to patrol the waters. I am concerned at the increase in the number of these incursions and what appears to be the growing seriousness of these incursions. I continue to take advice from the commander here about both the number of personnel required to man the squadron and the equipment that they need.
So the Secretary of State for Defence says he thinks Gibraltar's marine assets are sufficient to deal with Spain's incursions. You've called for the Gibraltar Squadron, the Royal Navy's local unit, to get a larger boat that would act as a deterrent, you say. That doesn't seem likely from Mr. Fallon's comments today. Well,
what I'm talking about, and I've been saying this for some time, even from the time that I was in opposition, is that the United Kingdom can do certain things which peacefully assert its sovereignty over the waters. So I'm not suggesting that there should be confrontation, because I think none of us want to see that. And we would all wish that Spain didn't bring about confrontation by her reckless incursions. But what we would, I think, all like to see is that the United Kingdom demonstrate its sovereignty over the waters in a positive way. Therefore, we are all very happy when we see visits from UK assets, whether they're nuclear submarines or whether they're other vessels that call here without having to seek anybody's permission to transit these waters and come into our port, because that demonstrates the fact that these are British waters. Therefore, I think if there were a larger vessel permanently here, not going out to confront Guardia Civil vessels, but actually simply asserting its own jurisdiction and sovereignty and control of these waters, then I think that would be a very positive thing. I've expressed that on a number of occasions to a number of different ministers in the United Kingdom, including the Prime Minister. I know the issue is kept under review. Don't forget that there is a huge amount of pressure on the Royal Navy because it hasn't got that many assets at the moment. There are assets on order, but there aren't that many assets available at the moment. And of course, if you're looking at this simply as a defensive piece, if you're looking at this from the point of view of sovereignty, is Gibraltar going to somehow be invaded, although these incursions could be described as invasions also, in a way that is going to be contrary to the interests of the civilian population on a permanent basis? Is this a permanent invasion that needs to be repelled? As we all know, it's just a nuisance coming in here to try and pretend to exercise jurisdiction, to try and pretend that they have sovereignty. We all know it's a waste of diesel. It annoys the Gibraltarian daylights out of all of us. But as I said in New York last week, and as we all know, those waters around Gibraltar, which we call British Gibraltar territorial waters, are British before, during and after these incursions, and the Spaniards are simply wasting diesel by coming into those waters and annoying us very much indeed. But in terms of a permanent deterrent, we don't need anything that's going to shoot at anything else. We need something that is going to peacefully and positively assert British sovereignty.
The Governor, Sir James Dutton, has said that he thinks arguably as much as possible is being done short of conflict, although I think he agrees with you that a larger marine asset might not go amiss.
Well, I think that the Governor and I are saying the same thing in slightly different ways, but with the same objective. I mean, I found Jim Dutton to be very much on side on this particular issue. I think he might have expressed things in a way that has been misinterpreted, but in respect of the issue of Gibraltar territorial waters, I think he's very clear in his view that if more could be done, it would be done, and this may be one of the issues that could eventually materialize.
I'm going to try and bring in some questions as they come in on both the telephone and the email. There's one here from Jonathan who says, not myself, I won't try to pronounce his surname, but I think it's Barcio. Jonathan Barcio. Why has the UK government adopted different ideas, rules and views, and I would imagine even rules of engagement in respect of the Falkland Islands from any sea incursions by any foreign member state, including Argentina? I think he's getting at a difference between perhaps the way that they deal with incursions here as to the way that they deal with incursions, he says, in the Falkland Islands. This is obvious due to the huge military presence at the Falkland Islands. What are your views, Chief Minister?
Well, it's a question about what the British government is doing, so I'm not the best person to answer it, but I can give you my views. Certainly it's true that in living memory, British blood has been spilt in defending the Falklands against an Argentine invasion. That is not the issue that we are dealing with here. Christina Kirchner has made statements recently which have been increasingly belligerent. None of the statements that we hear from Spain suggest that an invasion might somehow be imminent in any way. I think that we are in the intellectual debate on sovereignty. We are not in the physical debate on sovereignty, other than on the water, where there is this attempt to play cat and mouse games. You know, like every other Gibraltarian whose house looks out onto the bay, when I see these things, my blood boils. I think that a lot of my colleagues in the Foreign Office are now starting to understand this themselves, and their blood is starting to boil, and we just have to ensure that we communicate that to people in a way so that they understand what is actually happening down in this theatre and react to it in the way that we think is appropriate, but avoiding confrontation. Confrontation, if that is what Spain is seeking, will be very bad for all of us, but in particular for Gibraltar, and we have to seek to avoid that.
Well, Jared seems to think that you struck the right chord with your speech at the UN this year. He says he'd like to publicly congratulate you for a fantastic speech and for standing up for the people of Gibraltar.
Thank you.
Gibraltar's position on this is very different to Spain's. I think that's sort of putting it mildly. Let's have a look at what Spain's permanent mission to the United Nations said about incursions into British Gibraltar territorial waters last week.
Furthermore, the UK illegally seized other territories which were not ceded under the Treaty of Utrecht. This treaty clearly defines the areas ceded to the United Kingdom. Only the town and the Castle of Gibraltar, together with its port, with its internal waters exclusively, fortifications, and forts thereunto belonging were ceded. Spain did not cede territorial waters. What the UK describes as illegal incursions in British waters are simple routine activities of Spanish ships in Spanish waters.
Sino simples actividades rutinarias de buques españoles en aguas españolas.
So Spain tells the United Nations that the waters around the rock are Spanish and that she has every right to patrol them. How can there be such opposing views, the Gibraltar UK view and the Spanish view?
Well, it's interesting that you should pick up on that, because it's one of the things I picked up on in my speech this year. And what I was very keen to tell the members of the Fourth Committee was that the map that we defend, the grid lines that we defend, the median lines as they're called in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, are the convention lines that the United Nations has adopted. So what I was saying in my speech was, this is your map. The map that I'm talking about, with British Gibraltar territorial waters with these extensions, is the UN map. The map that Spain is talking about is not before you. So when Spain says these are Spanish waters and we are patrolling them, the problem, of course, that she has is that the map in front of people notionally at the UN is the map that shows that the waters are British. So Spain is trying to climb Everest without oxygen, and we have to appreciate that, and we have to understand what we do in the context of that as well. You know, she's not got an easy argument to make. It is an argument that exposes her to ridicule, and we have to continually try and point that out.
How receptive do you feel the different committees are at the United Nations to the message that you take as Chief Minister of Gibraltar?
They are two very different committees, and the Committee of 24 is made up of nations that we would not regard necessarily as friendly nations. For example, there is Syria, the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are countries there with which we might feel very little affinity, but they are there with a sacred trust, and they need to defend the rights of people who are subject to colonialism. The question is, how do they see us? And I think that's what we need to ask ourselves. Because we are British and the relationship with the United Kingdom is not strong, I think they may regard us as what the Spaniards call colonials by consent, simply because it is in their interest to take a position which is contrary to that of the United Kingdom. So we have an effort to make in order to lobby people to take the majority in that committee on our side, to ensure that there is a visit by that committee to Gibraltar, and to ensure that we are eventually delisted. This is not going to be an easy task, but we have to continue to attend the UN, lobby and persuade. One thing is for sure, if we don't continue to go and we don't continue to lobby, we will never be delisted and we'll never see a visiting mission from the UN. So the question is, do we make the effort to try and bring them here? And we must. The Fourth Committee is very different. It has the 193 nations of the United Nations represented in it. They are all bartering with each other for different issues at the UN. They listen to those who attend on the issue of Gibraltar and on Western Sahara and the other territories that address them on decolonization. But they are really just there to receive a report from the Committee of 24 and act upon it. Or
so you never really expect much back?
Well, in the case of Gibraltar, of course, they even go a little bit further, because they receive the Committee of 24's recommendation, and then they also have the two member states that are in dispute in relation to Gibraltar reaching a consensus decision that very easily enables them to say, well, that is the way we're going to deal with it.
Park it for now.
Indeed. And what we've tried to do is to ensure that that consensus decision now reflects the position of Gibraltar and the United Kingdom in a way that is clear and distinct from the position of Spain. I think if you look at the old consensus decisions, they were an attempt by the UK and Spain to reach an accommodation in writing. I think it's much better to have the mechanism we have now, where in writing Spain puts its position and the United Kingdom puts its position, which is very much that of Gibraltar, and there is no attempt to reach a written accommodation, which in fact shows two different positions, never the twain of which shall meet, and therefore it's almost impossible to come up with a synthesis of them in a consensus decision.
What about your own speech? Do you write that, or do you have somebody draft it for you?
I write all my own speeches. The Chief Minister of Gibraltar does not have the luxury of a speechwriter.
Something you might want to look into.
Are you applying?
Not right now, but you never know. I'd like to keep my options open. No, I mean, we were discussing before we actually went live on this program, West Wing, which is a program that we both have an affinity for.
Indeed.
It's about the United States of America and the Oval Office. They have script writers, but you write all of your own stuff. Do you have to discuss it in any way with anybody at the Foreign Office to let them know what you're going to say? Or
Perish the thought. No, look, I mean, Jack Kennedy did not write, is there something that you can do for your country? But Fabian Picardo wrote, wake up and smell the coffee, because Jack Kennedy had great people to think of what to say, and you've got to quickly come up with some way of conveying something when you're turning up at an international forum. I'm very lucky that I've got my friend and colleague Jose Garcia with me. He and I have been together for 20 years. We think the same way, and the question is, are we bouncing ideas off each other about how we're expressing the views? So I work very closely with him on any important international speech. Of course, I've got the advantage of having Joe Bolsano, who has the most experience of any Gibraltarian of attending UN sessions. And of course I have officials like Michael Llamas, Jamie Trinidad, who is now doing a doctorate, I think, a PhD in international law, who is also assisting the government of Gibraltar on these issues, and Ernest Gomez, who is fantastic in assisting me in ensuring that what I prepare makes sense in English as well as as in politics.
Okay, and you do travel. You've referenced some of the people who travel to the United Nations with you. You do travel with quite a team at the present
yes,
time.
and I think it's important that we should. I mean, there are ways of doing this. I mean, you can be a chief minister that does this on your own, and we've seen an example of that in the past, or you can be more collegiate in the approach that you take. You know, I am quite collegiate in the approach that I take. I like to involve people. I like to ensure that what we do reflects the sum total of the best minds coming together that government has available to prepare the best possible addresses. You know, whether people like my speeches or don't like my speeches, I write them, but I have a lot of input from third parties to ensure that I'm hitting the right note at that time, whether or not that is popular with Spain or, look, with colleagues in the Foreign Office. I try and ensure that we are on the same page as the United Kingdom. I think it's in our interest to be on the same page as the United Kingdom, but there's no question of the United Kingdom having a say on what the Chief Minister
Well, I
of
wasn't
Gibraltar
suggesting
says.
that. I just thought that you might, out of courtesy, let them know what you're going to say, so that they are, as it were,
No, there
informed.
are broad discussions between the United Kingdom and Gibraltar on what attitude to take in any particular year, weighing up together what have been the issues that have been of most concern in any particular year. I spend a lot of time when I'm in New York with ACMIS, so on this occasion I was with Ambassador Mark Lyle Grant in New York for a lunch with a number of heads of delegation, where we had the opportunity of talking to people who we might not otherwise reach at the UN. We have more of these planned to try and really step up our lobbying efforts. So the communication is very fluid with Foreign Office colleagues, but the speech of the Chief Minister of Gibraltar is written by the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. I think that has always been the case from the days of Sir Joshua, and I think it should continue to be the case. I think that's why the Gibraltarian passion comes across. It's written by a Gibraltarian.
Well, we've heard that Spain, what Spain tells the UN about the waters around the rock, basically that they're Spanish. Another significant issue in recent months for Gibraltarians and people who work in Gibraltar has been the frontier, of course. What about their comments in respect to the frontier? What does she tell the United Nations about the situation at the Gibraltar-La Línea crossing? We've got a short clip.
Desgraciadamente, las autoridades locales gibraltareñas,
Unfortunately, apart from mere rhetorical statements, Gibraltarian local authorities are not properly cooperating in combating all forms of illicit trafficking from Gibraltar, in particular, tobacco smuggling and money laundering associated with it. According to the data distributed by my delegation, this lack of cooperation in the fight against smuggling forces us to intensify the surveillance in the waters and the fence. The European Anti-Fraud Office made a field visit to the area in March of this year and has concluded in its report that there is enough evidence to believe that the crimes of smuggling and money laundering have been committed and that they have affected the financial and other interests of the European Union. This unilateral provocative attitude of the Gibraltarian local authorities is inconveniencing the inhabitants both of Gibraltar and Campo de Gibraltar and makes it even more urgent to put an end to this colonial situation.
fin a esta situación colonial.
So they've had Spain's permanent mission to the United Nations saying that your government's attitude is very provocative at the frontier and that ostensibly you are to blame for any suffering that frontier crossers have endured.
Well, we've heard it now for how many years has the frontier been open? 30 years. We heard it before the frontier was open because it was one of the excuses when the frontier closed. All the illicit traffic. In the late 90s, I know Mr. Kahana went through exactly the same sort of accusations and allegations. It was all the rage on the front pages of the newspapers in those days with Mr. Matutes, who ironically I think has his family give the word Matudera as its meaning, making those sorts of allegations against Gibraltar. Look, we know what the reality of this is. The government of Gibraltar has probably done more than any European government to control tobacco smuggling. Since I have been elected, I've put the price of tobacco up 63%, more probably than any chief minister in any period of their own election, and I've only been elected for 2 years and 10 months. So,
are you proud of that, or is that a circumstantial thing that you've been pressured?
I am very proud of that, because you know that we brought in our ban against smoking in public places. I'm very anti-smoking. I've said repeatedly that we need to reposition the Gibraltar economy away from tobacco smuggling, but it's a bit rich for the government of Spain to pretend that we are doing nothing in relation to tobacco smuggling. Let me just tell you that in the past 5 years, Gibraltar has strengthened its legislation against tobacco smuggling. A lot of it in the last 2.5 years since we were elected. Spain has made it a less serious offence to smuggle tobacco in the past 5 years. So going from one particular type of criminal activity, which is serious and would lead to imprisonment, to making the smuggling of tobacco an administrative sanction. So look, if anybody needs to look at the way that their laws are operating and their attitude to tobacco smuggling, it's certainly not Gibraltar. Our police do an excellent job, our customs do an excellent job. They're always out there trying to ensure that if anybody's acting in breach of our Tobacco Act, they catch them. You look at the number of forfeitures in Gibraltar, the numbers of arrests and people stopped, they're probably much greater than the forfeitures that you see even in Spain. But of course, Spain wants to pretend that Gibraltar is the problem. How do they do that? In a place like the Gibraltar-La Línea frontier, which probably accounts for just under 10% of all the forfeitures of tobacco in Spain, they carry out 60% of their operations against tobacco activity. Well, look, that demonstrates that the figures are skewed, and they're skewed for a purpose. They're skewed for politics.
Yet the European Commission has made demands of the Gibraltar government, as it has of the Spanish government, to change the way that things work at the frontier to try and curb this problem yet further. How confident are you that your government will deliver all of those recommendations, and what do you think of the Spanish and the likelihood that they are going to follow through with what the European Commission has asked them?
Let me split that the answer into two. First of all, the European Commission has made recommendations, and I'm very confident that we're going to comply because we have already. The question now is enforcement of those provisions, which of course is not a matter for a politician, but I'm very confident that the customs and police authorities will ensure that they enforce those laws as they do all others, very competently indeed. But secondly, OLAF, which is not the Commission, has made recommendations as well. But we need to be clear about these things. The OLAF report was prepared by a Spanish investigating officer, and then much of the publicity given to it was given by a Spanish spokesperson for OLAF.
It was leaked as well, wasn't it?
In fact, and there was a leak in Spain of the report. This stinks to me, and it doesn't sound to me like the sort of activity that we'd like to see an important office like OLAF allowing itself to be dragged into. And I would see that in the future there should be true neutrality and independence applied to investigations about Gibraltar by not having any Spanish national involved, because in each of the examples which I can give you having Spanish nationals involved, like in the European Court case where the president of the court was the Spanish lady who'd been advancing arguments contrary to ours for all of her career, Mr. Almunia, and the actions that he's taken against Gibraltar, and the OLAF report, whenever we see Spanish nationals involved, they seem to act in keeping with the Spanish national interest and not in the interest of the European Union, as they are required to do. And when we have British citizens who are officials of the European Union involved, they play it straight down the line as they should and don't favour Gibraltar. So I think the safest thing for Gibraltar in future is to try and ensure that neither Brits nor Spaniards are involved in the forefront of any investigation to do with Gibraltar. We should ask for strict neutrality. There are 26 other member states. Let's avoid Brits or Spaniards being involved in any investigation. Then we might get a fair chance of the whip. Because if you look at the way that the Code Group have dealt with our Income Tax Act, Spain was left on its own objecting to the Gibraltar Income Tax Act when you had tax experts from the 27 other member states looking at our act independently. And yet look at the conclusions that Mr. Almunia, surprise, surprise, reached, which were completely contrary to those reached by the Code Group.
Okay, well, we wish you and your government every success in trying to win that battle.
Well, wish us, because we're all in it together.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you'll be the one fighting it with
Indeed.
the European Commission to make sure that they try and keep Spaniards out of those decision-making areas. There's a lot to discuss in the part 2. We've got some emails that I'd like to return to. We'll develop on all of the points that you're trying to ask the Chief Minister about in part 2. You're watching Viewpoint. We're speaking to Fabian Picardo, and we'll be back after a very short break.